Hello, global gardeners. Happy Monday. I only have one word to begin our show today. Brr. Maybe it should be brr. It is cold here in Colorado, and it's cold in most of the United States. Looking at your comments already, it's cold in Washington, it's cold in Idaho, it's cold in Michigan, it's cold in Ohio, it's cold in New Jersey, it's even cold in Texas, and portions of California are cold. This Arctic front that's rolled down into the country is just frigid. I took this picture of my garden just a few minutes ago, about 30 minutes ago, I guess it was. Mala and I were outside. Right now, for me here in Colorado, it is -5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's -21 degrees. And with the wind chill, it's closer to -25 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about -31 Celsius. So, pretty darn chilly. I'm not doing much outside today, and I'm guessing many of you are not getting out in your gardens today. So let's stay indoors and talk gardening. And one of the topics that I've noticed recently is about making changes to how we garden. Now, you might have seen the video that I did recently. I'm really changing up how I do my garden planning as far as my seed selection and the varieties I'm choosing. And I've thrown it out to you all to help me make a decision about what plants I'm going to grow this year because I want to try something completely new, which is not growing the things that I've grown before. And I needed that just because I like my gardening. I like the varieties I choose. I like how it all happens on a yearly basis, but I feel that I'm missing out on some of the opportunities by growing the same tomatoes every year and the same squash and essentially the same garden from one year to the next. I began thinking that there's so much more out there that I just won't have the opportunity to discover, that I was going to make just a complete change and try nothing but new plants. And it's been really exciting so far. I've had close to 200 recommendations from viewers like you on the plants that I should be trying in my garden this year. And so I spent a few hours yesterday going through that list, trying to narrow it down, looking up what the different varieties were. And it's exciting. It really is exciting for me to discover some of these things that I was not even aware of, but many of you are growing. So I think change can bring some of that excitement. It really can move your gardening to a new level, especially if you're trying to discover those new things. Now, after that video came out, Eli from In the Garden with Eli and Kate sent me a note saying, "Have you noticed how many YouTube channels are talking about making those changes?" And I had noticed it. I hadn't really thought much about it, but I've seen more happen since then. And you may have noticed that as well. A lot of the really big gardening channels on YouTube have made a video in the last week or so talking about how they're changing, how they're going to be gardening differently this year. And I thought it deserved some discussion. And so that's why it's the topic of today. Let's start with Frank Barnwell's comment. "I don't know about necessary, but it can be good or beneficial. Change is our prerogative if we like." And I really like the way that Frank said that because I think it should be a choice. I don't really think that you should be changing how you garden because somebody else is telling you that you need to change how you garden. I think it needs to be something that within ourselves we recognize it can improve our process. Like me, I'm thinking about my later years. I'm old, but not that old. I have many more years of gardening left. And I anticipate the later years of being so easy because I've discovered everything that is perfect in my garden. I've discovered that melon. I've discovered that squash, that pepper, that tomato. I've discovered the plants that do so well in my garden that it's easy. And so when I can't get out in the garden like I'd like to, and I can't work as hard as I'd like to, I want it to be easy. And one of the ways to discover those type of things is the change, the experimentation, trying those things new. So that's my choice. Others, you may have seen Kevin's video on epic gardening. He's grown so big and his business is now booming to the point that he can't do it the way that he has done it in the past. And now he has a team that's helping him out. And I don't know how he was very good in how he expressed it in his video, but I don't know how I or you might handle that as well when we are confronted with something that really forces us to change how we garden. Now, I've had many comments over the years from people who have lost a spouse, and their spouse was a big part of their gardening, and it forced them to change how they do it. Others had some type of medical catastrophe, and it required them to change how they garden. We don't have much control over that. But when we have the ability to choose our methods, I think we should consider taking those opportunities. And that's what I'm doing this year. And so today it's a discussion, and hopefully you'll be asking questions and you'll be sharing your stories with me. And we can maybe come to a realization that change can be a good thing in the garden. You don't need to upend everything you're doing like I am this year with my variety selection. I just turned it completely upside down and I'm handing the reins over to other people to help me figure out what I'm going to grow. It doesn't need to be that at all. It can be as simple as just trying one new plant or one different method in how you garden. And over the course of many, many years, if you think about that, I've been gardening for about 35 years now. And so if I tried one thing differently in a method, a gardening method every single year, that means I've exposed myself to 35 different methods. And that is close to what I've done. I know about hydroponics. I know about the mid-lighter method. I know about hugelkultur. I know about permaculture. I know a lot about different methods of gardening because from one year to the next, I seek that knowledge out and I try something new. I try growing in containers. I try growing in grow bags. I try growing in raised beds. I try growing in ground beds. I grow in hanging baskets. I grow in a greenhouse. Over time, if you allow yourself just one new thing per year, surprisingly, after all the years, you get to the point that you can look back on what you've accomplished. Suddenly, you recognize that you know a lot about gardening, and it happens just one topic at a time. So, that's one of those things we'll be talking about today. We'll see what else we have to throw out there. Let's look at what Scott H is asking. What would you recommend as an indoor microgreen setup in the Front Range area? So the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains is our part of Colorado here, and so microgreens are one of those things that this year, last year I kind of dabbled in it, and this year I'll be doing a little bit more. Microgreens for me is a new area of gardening, and I think, at least for those of us in Colorado, it does work well for indoors. Now, the thing about the microgreens, and this is kind of interesting, Scott, because it does give you some options. When we're starting our seeds to grow into seedlings for transplanting into our garden, we should have really good lights. Lights are very important to get those seedlings to be strong for transplanting. But microgreens we're harvesting before they turn into full-size plants. We really don't want them to get those thick stalks and to be sturdy. And so you don't need as extensive a light system. And especially if you're going to be harvesting microgreens very young, you don't need much light at all because the seed itself has all of the energy it needs to sprout and grow and set those first set of leaves. So, as far as beginning microgreens, I think just a warm location is ample, and most of the microgreens we're going to be growing are going to be used either in cooking or in salads in our kitchen. So I think a setup on your dining room table, on a corner counter in your kitchen, is really ideal for beginning with a microgreen setup for something small, spreading out the seeds, keeping them moist, letting them sprout, and then clipping them off to harvest. If you're looking for something much more substantial, then a seed starting setup like you might see in my videos when I'm using all of the lights and all of the trays to grow all of the peppers and all the tomatoes. You do the same type of setup for microgreens. You just have a flat filled with those hundreds of seeds and do the same kind of thing. But for most of us growing microgreens, I think doing it in your kitchen or near where you're going to use those greens is probably the most efficient way to set it up because they don't need a lot of light because you're not growing full-size plants. You just want that initial growth of the leaves and then you're going to be harvesting it. And so make it easy. And most gardening, I think when we plan our gardens, I suggest the same thing. Your garden setup should be as close to your back door as you can get it so that you're not walking a long distance. So you go out, you harvest, you bring it in, and you use it in your kitchen. That's why I like my green stock towers so much. They're right outside my kitchen door. And so I can just step outside and harvest the herbs and harvest the salad crops that I grow in my green stock. Same idea with microgreens or anything else I think that you might want to be growing. Two Gals Farm Work says microgreens are usually ready within 6 to 12 days, depending on the variety. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you've got that warm location, they're going to be germinating in just a few days and you're going to be harvesting in about a week. And so that's why it's not as important to have that really big setup that we would be doing for peppers that need to grow for 12 weeks before you put them outside. So thank you, Two Gals. And DJ says microgreens can start harvesting in a little after a week in a small arrow garden. There you go. Very easy. Yeah. And arrow gardens, you see the arrow gardens advertised quite a bit. But for most of us, it can be much easier than that. Just a simple flat and your seeds and water. And it really isn't much more than that when you start doing the microgreens. I wanted to do a microgreen video last year and just never got around to it. So keep your fingers crossed. Maybe I'll do a microgreen video this year and I can help you out with some of that as you move forward. Okay, let's see. Life of Tranquility is saying, I want to start a small greenhouse in my tiny backyard. What materials do I need to start up? By the way, I live in South Florida. So South Florida gives you a lot of options. The one issue, I did the video this summer talking about the ventilation. When you're growing in a warm region or like Florida, a hot region, ventilation is really, I think, the most important thing when it comes to growing in a greenhouse. So in a small greenhouse, in a tiny backyard, you need to think in terms of placing it so that you can have windows and doors or flaps or something that you can really open up the greenhouse during the day to let the air out. Because the greenhouse is going to build up heat and you need that heat to dissipate. As far as the materials, consider what kind of weather you have. Now, I know Florida can get some horrendous thunderstorms. And so, like here in Colorado, I built my greenhouse out of the polycarbonate. so that it could withstand the thunderstorms that we get, particularly the hail from the thunderstorms. So think about materials that you would want to use that can handle the heavy rain and the winds that would be part of the thunderstorms that you get in Florida. So I tend to like the hard materials for a greenhouse, the polycarbonate covering, because they can handle a lot of that abuse from the weather. But even plastic, a greenhouse rated plastic, usually at least 6 mil thick with UV protection, is often a great way to start with greenhouse growing. And especially if you're new to it, and you're in a region like Florida where you don't need a lot of insulation to hold in the heat, consider doing something like that, growing with a greenhouse plastic that'll come in a roll, and you just lay that over whatever your frame happens to be. So an easy material that can withstand the weather and lots of ventilation so that the heat doesn't get built up too much. And I think that would be a good way to start thinking about what you're going to do with your greenhouse. And I've got quite a few videos. In fact, I think 3 of my last 4 videos are about greenhouse growing. So I'm learning a lot more as I go along, in addition to the years I spent growing in the big greenhouse at the Galileo School. So even if you think you know about greenhouse growing, there's always new stuff to learn. And that's why I always encourage that you start small, start simply, and start inexpensively, so you don't put too much into it and find out that it really doesn't work in your area, or maybe it's something that you really don't enjoy as much as you would like or expect to be growing. Madge S. Retired says, "Hello, Gardener Scott. Love your channel. My first live. Off. Awesome. Glad to have you here." And so it's one of these things we get together, of course, every Monday, and I'm glad you could make this live. I don't know if that's because of the holiday or not, but always nice to have you here. And so the basic guidelines for those of you that might be new here is participate, make comments, but more importantly, ask your questions. If you got a question about your garden or what you're doing, or if you have a story that you want to share, by all means, share the stories and ask those questions, and we'll keep rolling along. Dusty Flat says, "I dug carrots under 20 inches of snow Saturday and brought a bag of soil in, and apparently a mouse." Okay. Was it a live mouse or a dead mouse? Mala brought in a mouse for me a couple days ago. She's this time of year, I think she finds the mice out in the compost pile, but she usually brings in at least one mouse a week this this time of winter. And so finding the mouse in your bag of soil, I'm guessing it was probably a live mouse. But that's an interesting idea also that you bring up. When we grow our root vegetables, and you've heard me recommend this before, grow your root vegetables into fall. You usually start the seeds in summer, grow into fall, and then you can harvest, depending on the root, throughout the winter. And so my ground does freeze pretty solid, but I have harvested carrots and beets from under the snow, and that's always a nice way to get out and do some gardening on those cold days. So 20 inches of snow is a nice insulator, and I'm glad you were able to get some of your carrots. Lisa DeKramer says, "I want to use my greenhouse for seed starting. I'm finding I need to bubble wrap the greenhouse, need electricity run, and purchase a heater. The cost really adds up quickly." Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I say start small and start inexpensively, because I think it's a common misconception. A lot of gardeners think that you can start seeds in a greenhouse, get a greenhouse and start seeds. But depending on where you live, you might not be able to do that without the extra heat and the extra insulation and that extra expense and time to make it happen. I love watching Eli and Kate's videos, and they're doing that right now. They're starting seeds in their greenhouse in Scotland, but that's because they're staying warm enough that they don't have to worry about the extreme cold like some of us are, and they have the electricity in their greenhouse that they can supply extra light and heat if they need to. So I love all of the greenhouse videos. Good information from in the garden and Eli and Kate if you want to grow in a greenhouse, but do recognize that electricity makes a big difference and the extra insulation makes a big difference. And as Lisa says, the cost adds up quickly. And so for me in my greenhouse, I don't have electricity and I don't have that additional heat. And so I recognize that I'm not going to be growing a lot of plants in winter. And I'm also not going to be able to start seeds in my greenhouse. My greenhouse, as I did this last year, is primarily suited for hardening off the plants, for growing during the cool spring and the cool late autumn. That's how I'm using my greenhouse because I don't have electricity. So I'm starting all my seeds indoors. And then as they get bigger and as the greenhouse becomes warmer than my garden area, I can move my plants out into the greenhouse to finish off and then to harden off before I put them in the garden. That's all part of greenhouse growing is recognizing what works best for you and it may not be best for everybody else. And so I'm already changing how I'm using my greenhouse because I'm finding that all that water that I put in is actually much more effective than I thought it would be. Uh, 2 days ago, and you may have seen this, I posted it on Instagram. It got down to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. That's minus 24 Celsius. Inside my greenhouse, it got down to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, about minus 11. Now, that's a big difference. That means that my greenhouse is maintaining two hardiness zones warmer than my outside garden. So I'm in zone 5. I can start growing zone 7 plants as long as I keep them in my greenhouse over the course of the winter. So this is a revelation for me and it really opens up a lot of opportunities and is going to change some of how I garden, particularly container gardening and using my greenhouse. And that's why I say I would have never known that if I hadn't actually started tracking the temperature and using my greenhouse in a different way to figure out how I could best use it. And so think about that. That's why when I recommend trying new methods and trying to figure out how you're going to garden differently, you may discover options that you didn't even know you had by looking into some of those type of activities, be it a greenhouse, a polytunnel, cold frames. There's lots of things that we can use, especially when we live in a cold region that can really expand the gardening and what we're doing with it. Lawrence Tagrin is saying, I'm 75 years old with back problems and have been designing all my changes to take my physical needs into account. Excellent. I've moved to all grow bags so I never have to get down on my knees. Great example. Thank you for sharing that, Lawrence. That's 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 a perfect example of how we recognize change in our garden, especially if it is driven because of our own physical changes. And so I love that. Yeah, that's a big reason why I have my raised beds, my sturdy wooden beds is because of my back issues as well. And why I'm starting to figure out how I can use my greenhouse and containers for the same reason as you point out. Moving to grow bags is another great option for doing that. So thank you for sharing that, Lawrence, because it's it's something that for those of you that are still young and years away from those physical changes, think about it now. You don't necessarily have to change how you're doing, but at least stick it into your thought process that the day will come that you're going to have to garden differently. And so if you learn how to modify some of your methods along the way, when that time comes, it's not going to be that big an issue. Yeah, my back hurts. I've talked about this before. Just don't get out and do as much of the heavy lifting, literally, that I used to do in the garden. We change. And whether we like it or not, the way our gardening looks today is going to be different than the way our gardening looks 10 years from now and 20 years from now and even beyond that. So if it's a cold day in winter and you've got nothing else to think about, start looking at some of those videos and start reading some of those blogs and start thinking about what modifications you might want to consider that will make gardening easier so much in the future. Like Lauren says, grow bags so you don't have to get down and hurt your back. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. Uh, DLR 978 is saying, I put some grow bags on sliders. Don't know the name of them, but what mechanics use to slide under cars. So, great idea. Yeah, I uh, I have I'm not sure what they're called too either, but that's a great idea. Putting your containers on wheels. That's one reason why I like the green stalks as well, because they spin and they roll, and it allows me to move them around as needed as well. So sliders for your grow bags really make it easy to move, and especially if you are wanting to shift the position or clean up your garden, slide the bags rather than lifting them. I like that idea. Gardens Happen says, I couldn't get my bed ready, so I'm filling the bed with grow bags to grow in instead. I like that idea. I saw a picture. I'm not sure what it was. I was doing some raised bed research this weekend, and I came across a picture of a raised bed with a bunch of grow bags in it. And so I hadn't really seen that before. And now you're talking about the same thing. So great idea. Yeah. The sides of of the beds can, if it's a raised bed, can help support the grow bags. And if it's an in-ground bed, put the grow bags on top of the soil. Absolutely. So I like that idea. That's an interesting suggestion. And again, one of those things, you've got a bed, you can't fill it. Well, you can fill it. Just fill it with grow bags or pots. I have seen gardeners that put pots in their raised beds to fill that space as well. So wonderful idea. Becoming a green stalker. Green stalks are the only reason I garden. I would have never guessed that, becoming a green stalker, mostly because I don't like bugs and dirt. That's good. Yeah, green stock is really a nice option, and they've got some new colors. I always have my link to green stock in the description below, but they're coming out with some new colors, and I understand they've got some other new things that are going to be coming up in the future as well. So I've got three colors, and I'm falling way behind with the color options that they're throwing out there. So I'm sure I'm going to have to add something else. Bowtie Life is saying, I cannot believe the difference with the green stock. I'm seriously considering getting more. There you go. Absolutely. Yeah, it is one of those things that not only because of the colors, I like to have different colors. But yeah, you get one, then you get two, and then you get three. I'm at three right now, and I'm definitely considering getting more. So, yeah, click on that link if you're wondering what the green stock is all about, because once you have it, it's easy to get hooked. And especially when you've got a name like Becoming a Green Stalker, I think that says a lot about it. And uh, Becoming a Green Stalker has 26 of green stocks. Wow. I, I don't think that's crazy. I think that is dedication. And so good for you to have 26 of the green stocks. I hope you're taking advantage of the Gardner Scott code, because if you can save $10 on each one you get, then you'll be getting free ones before you even know it. So awesome. Green stock is a lot of fun. Llama Llama just got their fifth green stock. I don't think you have a problem. Like I said, I'm just really trying to hold back and avoid getting my fourth, but I know it's coming. It's just one of those things. Waveline Sanson Ward says, so much great information here on raised beds. I'm putting raised beds on my deck this year because of the deer and rabbits. What are your thoughts on winter seed sowing some vegetables? Oh, absolutely. So the thing about winter seed sowing, and I think I saw Heidi at the beginning of the show talk about being a month behind the winter seed sowing. And so the idea is that you put your seeds out. For those of you that don't know, you put your seeds out in winter, not expecting that they're going to germinate. But seeds have the built-in temperature recognition in their genetics, and when the temperature is appropriate and when the moisture level is appropriate, they'll germinate. And so you can sow your seeds in the middle of winter, can save a lot of time because we're usually not doing anything in the garden except uh, during the winter, except when we force ourselves to get out there to take a picture on a really cold day. And so it gets you out in the garden and you're putting your seeds out, and then nature will determine when those seeds germinate and begin growing. And I think it can work wonderfully in a green stock, just as any other area of your garden. The key factor and the I would say the limiting factor in a green stock is that you can see in my background here, I've got snow on the ground. Temperatures are going to be warming up this week. That snow's going to melt probably on Thursday, and that moisture is going to go into the ground. What even if it's frozen, it's going to absorb some of that moisture over the course of the spring. The ground's going to be moist and wet, and that's just what happens in our environments. But in a green stock, because of the tower and the container setup that it's designed to be, the soil tends to dry out pretty quickly. And we don't typically water our green stalks in the winter because we don't have anything actively growing in it. And so the winter sowing will work great in a green stock, but you need to make sure that you're going to be watering the green stock in early spring, probably before you normally would, because that soil needs to be moist for those seeds to germinate at the appropriate time based on the weather and the temperature. And so I've seen that in my own winter sowing when I throw out the seeds. If it's at a really dry area that I'm not watering, those plants are not going to germinate and grow. You have to have that supplemental water in an area that is not getting the snow melt and it's not getting the rainfall and is going to dry out faster. So I think winter sowing vegetables in a green stock is a great idea. Just make sure that you're watering the green stock so that they will germinate and grow. And if you do that, I've also done, so I did it with the basil that I grew in the green stock this last year. I showed some of that in a video. I don't always show the other plants, but I'll, to save time, I'll actually start germinating and growing lettuce and basil and those type of plants that I'm putting into my green stock, so that when the weather is warm enough, when the soil has thawed, then I can put the transplants in and they're already growing, as opposed to starting. I do a lot of seeds in my green stock, but just to get that jump start, I'll start the seeds indoors in early spring and then I'll transplant into the green stock and then also put seeds in the green stock. So a lot of it just comes down to how much patience you have and how quickly you want to get started with getting those plants growing. And yeah, there's Jay on top of things with one of my videos on the green stock vertical garden system. It really is a lot of fun, and um, it's something that, and I'll be shaking things up a little bit. Those kindergartners that I've been working with in Canada, and they're growing in a green stock in their classroom, and they've given me some really good ideas, and so I'll be making some changes. This gets back to the whole idea of change in the garden. you'll make changes in your garden without even realizing that you were going to make changes in your garden. And for me, the green stock is one of those things. I saw how these kindergartners and how Jan, the teacher, is using the green stock in the classroom, and it gave me some ideas of some things that I'm going to be trying with my green stock. And so you'll probably see that those modifications in the videos to come. But I really didn't think of it as a change. I looked at it as more as just oh, that's a cool idea. I think I'll try that. And now it's a different way of doing things. So change doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need to be something that stresses you out. It can just be some minor modification in how you do things for enjoyment. And I think that's really important when we look at change. It doesn't need to be a bad thing. It can be a good thing, and it can be fun in the process. Von Dykstra, thank you so much for that super chat. When do you start feeding seedlings, and what do you use to feed them? As always, thanks for all your help. Well, you're very welcome. And so a lot of it depends. And so if you've seen my videos on how I make my seed starter mix and then how I make my potting soil mix, I don't add any additional fertilizer for my seedlings. I don't feed my seedlings in addition to that. And so my seed starter mix, it has essentially no nutrients. It's all peat and perlite, or peat and vermiculite. And it's just to get the seed started. It's very loose material so that those little roots can start growing. And then once the seedling is strong enough, after the true leaves are growing, then I'll transplant those seedlings into my growing mix, my potting soil. And that potting soil is made with nutrients. And so I've got worm castings in that mix, I've got compost in that mix, and I've got some fertilizer in that mix, organic fertilizer from IV Organic. And so the mix itself has the nutrients that those little seedlings need. That's the approach I take. And so with the worm castings and the compost and the IV Organic balanced fertilizer, my seedlings grow to the point that they're ready to transplant outside. If you're not following that process where you're going from a nutrient poor medium and you need a nutrient rich medium, that's the point that you need to start feeding your seedlings. So if you start your seedlings in a seed starter mix, and you're not planning on putting them into a richer potting soil, when they start showing their true leaves, that's when they need the nutrients to continue growing. And that's when you would feed your seedlings. If you're reusing a potting mix or using a potting mix that doesn't have the addition of compost and fertilizer, that's when you need to start feeding the seedlings. And then it becomes a lot of it depends on the seedling. It depends on when you're going to be transplanting outside. But I don't like to over fertilize, especially the seedlings. It can really make them weak if they're getting too much fertilizer. And so every 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the plant, you'll want to add another dose of feeding. And because over fertilization can be a problem with seedlings, what you've probably seen before is that you dilute the fertilizer. So you basically are using a half strength or a 1/3 strength fertilizer when you're doing the nutrient feeding for your seedlings, because you can burn the roots is typically the term that's used. If it's too much of the fertilizer, and it usually is the nitrogen component, and so a lot of the nitrogen fertilizers is ammonium, and ammonia is where that comes from, and it can literally burn the roots if it's too high in that nitrogen ammonium. It will it will literally damage the roots and it can kill those seedlings. So that's why it's a half strength, so that you lessen that possibility. But it really does come down, Vaughn, to how the mix is formulated as to whether you're going to be feeding those seedlings at all. And so if you look at all my videos on seedlings, you will see that I don't have it in any of my videos feeding with a fertilizer, because I put the fertilizer in that mix that the roots are growing into, and that's enough to sustain the growth. So hope that helps. If you're using a good mix, you don't need fertilizer. But if you're not using a good mix, once the true leaves develop, and then about every 2 or 3 weeks with half strength beyond that point, and then you put them out to the garden and everything should work well. And so Danny Bolander's asking, does anyone know how long Roundup stays in the soil and will raised beds wick it up into the soil in the beds? So if you look at the testing that's been done on glyphosate, that's the chemical in Roundup, you'll see that it actually becomes inert when it hits the soil. And so it only affects the plants when you spray it onto the plants. Now, when it gets into the soil, it does have a half-life. I forget exactly what it is. I think the half-life is somewhere in the 3-month category. But once it hits the soil, it's not going to be drawn up by the plants. So Roundup is different than a lot of the other herbicides that are used that might contaminate straw or hay or some of those other things that are in the garden. And the glyphosate in soil does not have the same impact on the growth of the plants as when you spray it directly onto the plant. And so that's a key difference in knowing about how the Roundup works, and the fact that it really isn't a problem in the soil. It's a problem on the plant itself, and any residue that might remain on the plant as well is what you have to be concerned with, not what drops into the soil or happens to be in the soil. And you can see that if you do an in-depth search, all that testing, all of those scientific results are available, and you can see exactly how the glyphosate works or not works, literally, when it gets into the soil, and as opposed to how effective it can be at killing plants when it's sprayed on the plant itself. Yeah, there you go. JujiB 2407 says the half-life can range from 3 to 249 days. And exactly right. The soil microorganisms break down the glyphosate right away. So it's not as big an issue as you might be concerned about. It's the aminopyralids, which is a completely different family of herbicides, that are really the ones that you have to be more concerned about, and that they're the ones that tend to be on the hay and straw and can contaminate the soil and the broadleaf plants you're going to be growing in your garden. So that's definitely something that you should be aware of, but at least as far as the Roundup is concerned, it's not as big a problem as you might be aware of. But it's more because of, if you spray a plant in the vegetable garden and it has that residue, and that residue gets onto another plant, that other plant's going to be killed as well. And so that's why typically we're not going to be using the glyphosate in the vegetable garden, because in the wind, as those plants are blowing back and forth, they could pass that liquid from one plant to another if it's still wet, and now you've killed more than that one plant. That, look at the label, it says don't apply on a windy day for the same reason. If it blows onto a plant, that plant's going to be dead as well. So you do have to be careful how you're going to be using that, because it's just so devastating when it gets on the plants. And Tammy Bolander saying, I don't use it, but it's been used in the yard where we're moving. It was last used in 2022. There will no longer be any chemicals sprayed in that yard. Yeah. If it's been a couple years, don't worry about it at all. And especially if it was sprayed back then, the half-life is long over, and it's not going to be in the soil. So it's really not going to be affecting your plants at all. Riverdale, nice to see you guys here today. Last few years, I just sift my regular potting soil and start in slightly bigger cells. Skipping the seed start mix step has worked great for me and easier. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm doing more and more of that. I showed that last year in some of my seed starting with uh, the red solo cups in particular. I'm going to be doing more and more of that this year as well, just starting in a bigger cell and skipping the seed starter step. But when I'm growing a lot of plants, I do the two-step process just because of the the the, the consideration that it takes up less space. If you're using the 1-inch cells and you're growing 72 plants, it takes up less space than if you're using 3-inch pots and growing 72 seedlings. So that's a big reason why I've done it. But I'm gonna try. I'm really gonna try this year to grow fewer plants so that I don't need as many pots and I don't need as much soil and I don't need as many lights. And so I'm keeping my fingers crossed. But based on all those recommendations of the new varieties, I don't know if I'm going to be able to hold to that plan. I think I'm going to end up growing a lot more than I had originally intended because there's just a lot of really cool plants out there that I'm discovering. And I have many of you to thank for that because uh, there's just so many fun plants out there that we just don't have enough time to find them all and grow them all. Moondust says, I saw your video for medicinal plants. With the prices going up, I'm highly considering a medicinal garden to begin practicing herbalism alongside green witchcraft. Good for you. Yeah, and so if you haven't seen that video yet, I think the a big takeaway as I started learning more about the herbalism and making medicines from plants, many plants that many of us are already growing can be used medicinally. And so just learning more about your plants is an important step if you've been thinking about that the health aspects of your garden as far as what your garden can supply for you in terms of making you healthier. And then once you have that initial exposure that you find out that the dandelions in your garden are actually beneficial and the plants like echinacea are beneficial and plants like comfrey and stinging nettle, some of those plants are considered weeds in many areas and they've got great health benefits. Once you recognize what you already have and how it can be good for you, then it becomes really easy, like Moondust says, considering a medicinal garden and add more of those plants with very specific purposes. And so Eli commented on that video about the Greek mountain tea, and she uses that and buys it and hasn't been able to grow it in her garden. But I looked at it and I think it will work in my garden. And so that's all part of the change as we modify and try new things with our gardening. So I've added it to my list, found a source. I'm going to be getting some of the Greek mountain tea to grow specifically for that purpose of the medicinal aspect, for helping the overall body. And I'll be doing that with a lot of the other teas because the echinacea fits real well with that. The stinging nettle works real well with that. The Greek mountain tea works real well with that. There are a lot of those things that you just dry the plant and drink it as a tea, and that can make a big difference in how you feel and what's happening in your body as well. So I think it's an exciting opportunity and why I wanted to make that video because it's something that is new and it's changed how I look at my plants and how I'm planning to use my plants. Now, I grow mint and I make mint tea because I like the taste of mint tea. But when you look into it more, mint tea can actually be beneficial from a health perspective. And so think about how you garden now and why you garden now. And if you can add just that one little change so that you are intentionally using it to benefit yourself, you really haven't changed your gardening. You're still growing the same plants. You've just changed how you use those plants moving into the future. And I think that can really make a big difference. Tennessee Nana is saying Danu's Irish herb garden has loads of information about medicinal plants and how to use them. She lives in Western Ireland. So thank you for that. I'm not aware of that. I'll add that to my notes and have to look that up later on. Yeah, there's a ton of information out there. Now, you do need to be aware that and I kind of throw it into the category of old wives' tales. There's a lot of information out there that has been passed down from generation to generation, and some of it is very effective and some of it is not so effective. And so I do, of course, recommend doing as much research as you can before you make some of those modifications in your diet and before you start using some of these plant-based medicines. And it's best to get multiple sources, and especially if you can find some of the research. So when I was looking at comfrey, for instance, I mentioned comfrey in that video. The National Institute of Health actually has information about comfrey and how to use it and how you shouldn't use it. And there are many medical journals that talk about plants as well. I prefer to get that type of information that actually is research based and that has studies that show how the plants affect your body rather than grandma told Aunt Molly and Aunt Molly does it and that's why you should do it. I do suggest you try to get as much scientific information as you can, but not everything has that, and there's a lot of good anecdotal evidence that people are doing with their gardens that might benefit you as well. But Jenkins is saying, I tend to start too many plants every year. It's so hard to restrain myself when I'm starting seeds. You and me both. And I've said that many, many times, Bud. But I don't think that's a bad thing. Every year I have more plants than I need. And I just give them away. Last year and the year before, I took all my extra plants to my garden club plant sale and sold the plants along with a lot of other people who grew too many plants. And we earned the money for our garden club for that year. So uh, restraining yourself is a good goal. But if you find that you can't restrain to the point that you would like, just find another outlet, find someone to give those plants to, and it makes you feel really good. And it isn't as big a problem anymore when you actually find a home for all of those plants that you overgrew. Absolutely. Becoming Green Stalker. Rosemary Gladstar's book is the one that I suggested in the video I made. And I agree. That's one reason why I like it. It's very easy to understand and it has some really good recipes in it. And so I think starting with a book like that has recipes and also gives some of that medicinal background is a good way to start with the medicinal garden. Motai Life says, I always try too many plants. It's always easy to find folks who could use them. There you go. That's exactly the way to do it. Yeah, it's all relative as to what too many plants really means, but it's just I think it's so rewarding. And one of the things that causes me to have too many plants is the assumption that the plants aren't going to grow, that the seeds aren't going to germinate. So I need to start extra seeds in case I don't have good germination. And then what always happens is they all germinate. And so I've just had too many bad seeds in years past that I haven't gotten over that assumption that the seeds just aren't going to be good. Nowadays, even the seeds I save, I have great germination rates for. And so it's expecting the worst and then getting way more than you ever anticipated, which you could look at as being better because there's always folks that can benefit from them if you can find someone to hand them out to. Skippy Dugan, I like growing herbs and plants for tea so that I can enjoy it in the winter when it's cold like today. it gives me a feeling of connection to my garden. Absolutely. And that's what I've done. And that's why I say, and in that video, I show my jar of the mint. And that's why I harvest my mint, is to make a nice mint tea in the middle of winter. Absolutely. And along with all those other herbs that I dry for making tea. That's what I've always done, is just to have that nice soothing cup of the chamomile tea in the middle of winter. And it's the chamomile that I grew myself. Oh, yeah. Wonderful feeling of connection with the garden. But the more I learn and the more I try, actually, the reason the chamomile tea and the mint tea make me feel nice and warm and comfortable is because of some of those health benefits that are actually in the plant. So it's no coincidence that those of us that make tea from our garden really get that connection, because it really does help our body feel better, and gardening tends to make us feel good. And so it's just a continuation, that especially during the cold months, to enjoy those kind of things. Absolutely. CJ Don says, extremely important to check for dosage and drug interactions with herbs. Absolutely. The challenge with homegrown grown medicinal plants is potency or the lack thereof. You are exactly right. And that's why I say check for that that source that has those studies that show you exactly how much you can use or how much you should use. And if you are on a medication, read all of the fine print in that medication, because it will tell you what you can and can't have. Grapefruit is one of those things that is so surprising to me. Grapefruit is not supposed to be taken with many medications, and there are other things that fall into that same category as well. So thank you, CJ Don. Dosage and drug interaction, very important when you're considering trying some of these new things. Grow Big TV. What would be the top 6 medicinal herbs you would put in the green stock? Good question. And so um, when we talk about medicinal herbs, it depends on what benefit you're trying to get from it. Now, for me, what I'm most focused on right now is that relaxing cup of tea, and and that's how I'm approaching the medicinal herbs right now. So for me, it's those things like the the basil and the chamomile and the mint, and I would even throw borage in there. There's plants like that that can grow pretty easily, and I grow them as an annual. But depending on how you're using your green stock, you can also grow sage and rosemary and lavender in the green stock. And so that short list are the plants I'm actively growing that also have a medicinal aspect to them, and they can all be grown in the green stock. The key consideration is whether it's a perennial plant like the lavender and the rosemary and the sage that comes back every year, and even oregano. Oregano I consider a perennial plant. It comes back every year, and it also falls into that medicinal herb category as well. Or the ones that we treat more as an annual, and like the chamomile and the basil. So just about any herb that you want to grow can be grown in a green stock, and just about any herb you grow is going to have some type of medicinal aspect to it, depending on whether you make it into a tea or a salve or a tincture. There's all kinds of options when it comes to the herbs that we want to be growing. And yeah, absolutely, the green stock is a great way to be growing a lot of those things, because it's just so easy. Rick Thalian is saying chamomile tea in a week can be used in seed starting. I've recently seen to soaking seed. Like a week tea. Yeah, you can make a chamomile tea and use it as start of your seed starting. And there's other herbs like that fall into that category, that you can soak your seeds if you're concerned about the seeds. If you think that they might have some type of disease or contamination. You can soak your seeds. And I've never done that, Rick, but I have seen chamomile along with many other teas that you can make to soak your seeds. So yeah, completely different area of the use of herbs in our garden for for soaking the seeds, for feeding the seedlings. You can actually make weak fertilizers out of many of those herbs as well. And like comfrey falls into that. The comfrey and dandelion and stinging nettle, make a tea with those and use that to feed your seedlings. And that is a nice diluted fertilizer that can actually benefit the plants as well. J.K. Gardner, hello to you. Glad to have you here today. And so nice to see new people and lots of regulars. Owen says apple cider vinegar diluted is a great seed starter, supposedly. I haven't used that. That's because of the acid that's in the cider vinegar, and that's also to try to kill any of those pathogens that might be on the seed coating as well. And diluting it, of course, helps prevent potential problems. But even full strength vinegar for a brief period of time shouldn't affect your seeds too much. But as with seeds and seedlings, diluting usually tends to make it less damaging if there is going to be any type of damage on those seeds or those young seedlings. So I want to talk a little bit more about the background today. And you can see that Mala is sitting here. She, of course, goes with me every time I go in the garden. And I don't know about your garden dog, but Mala just loves spending so much time out there. I've got a dog door. She can go in and out. But on these cold days that we've been having, I've been shutting the door. And so she can't go out as regularly. And so it's one of those things when you have a dog that has free access to the outside and then they're shut off from that access, they tend to bother you a little bit more about wanting to go outside. And then she goes outside and it's a day like we had with the minus 12 Fahrenheit, minus 24 Celsius. She still goes out for a surprisingly long amount of time and then comes in and immediately runs to bed and curls up and gets warm again. So I love having my garden dogs, and on these cold days, it's just a lot of fun to see how they spend time in the garden. But the time that I'm out there with her, she enjoys more. So even when it's really, really cold, and I've said this before, I still try to go out to my garden every single day. And a day like today, that it is so frigid cold and the wind chill is so extreme, I'm still outside with my garden dog, checking things out and soaking up all of that garden energy, even though it's frozen energy. It just gets me excited to now come in and, like yesterday, spend a couple hours going through the seed catalogs, doing some of the research as to what's actually going to be able to grow in my garden. And we're only about 2 months away from springtime. And those of us that even have long winters, we can get out and start growing in March and April, depending on what it is we're growing. So I'm chomping at the bit for that. Yeah, I think it's funny though. If you're like me, you're spending these cold winter months looking at videos, reading books, getting ideas for what you're going to be doing in your garden, the changes that you might be making. And I just have to say, and I haven't forgotten this, and I say it regularly, just be aware of the information that you're getting and weigh it against your own experience and the experience of gardeners in your area. I saw a video just yesterday talking about the 10 trees anyone can grow. Number one on the list is lemon trees. Now, of course, that comes from self-sufficient me in Australia. And of course, for him, a lemon tree is a top 10 tree. But here in Colorado, you can't grow lemon trees. So just take all of the information you get that said what you can be doing in January. There's a ton of videos out there now that say the 10 things you can be growing in January. Well, not in frozen Colorado or frozen Ohio or frozen Michigan or Canada. Just be careful, especially if you're new to gardening, about the information you're paying attention to and whether you can actually do it in your area or not. So, it's all good information. You can use it. Just be careful of what you actually do in your garden and try to match it with the uniqueness of your very specific garden so that you're not wasting your time and trying to grow a lemon tree that will die in winter. Absolutely. Blue Veil Meadows, how do you keep your dogs out of your garden beds? Mine seem to think they're dig boxes. So there's a couple things I do. And I actually made a video a couple years ago when I first got Mala. So the first step was training, working with her in the garden so that when she ventured into an area that she wasn't supposed to be in, I corrected her and she learned pretty quickly what areas she could go to and which areas she couldn't go to. And then that's a big reason why I have raised beds is to help keep the dogs out of the garden. But with Mala, she really likes to go after the gophers. And so I have had an issue with Mala jumping up on some of the beds and digging in some of the beds, trying to get the gophers that are underneath the beds. Even though I've got wire mesh under those beds and the gophers aren't there, I don't know if she can hear them or if she's just thinking that that's where they would be. And so if you look at many of my videos over the course of this last year, I have my metal cattle panel hoops on my beds all the time. And a big reason for that is just to keep Mala from jumping in the beds. It helps protect the plants. Those hoops help support plastic and shade cloth and bird netting and everything else. But that's one of the things I've had to learn with her is she's just got so much energy and she's going after the birds and the mice and the gophers. And if she wants to go from point A to point B and there's a bed in the way, she'll jump on the bed. And so I just have to have that obstacle. I just have to have that metal hoop over the bed to help keep the dogs out. My previous dogs were Labrador retrievers. They weren't as active as far as jumping up and digging in a bed. And so they were much easier to train and keep out of the beds. And so they would just lie down and watch me garden most of the time. Mala's much more active, so I need that barrier to keep her from digging in the beds and causing more turmoil. So it in that case, Mala has caused so much damage to plants, and actually on some of my trees more damage than the deer. And so I put up those barriers around my trees and around my bushes and in my beds for the deer, and they double as protection against Mala. And so I hate to say that you want your dog to be an active participant, but without a barrier, they could definitely cause more damage than you would really want. Lisa DeCramer says, my dogs love to eat the greens. Yeah. And when I was training Mala when she was young, I would use carrots to train her. And she loves eating carrots. And so those are the beds I really have to protect because once she finds out there's carrots in the bed, she'll jump in the bed and eat the carrots. She doesn't eat the greens as much, but she'll definitely dig and get the carrots if she has that option. So a barrier is definitely something to consider if you've got an animal that's eating your plants and they're not supposed to be eating your plants. And Blue Veil Meadows says, yeah, the dogs love the herbs. So there's, like most dogs, Mala will occasionally eat grass, the grass that's growing around the edges, but I haven't had that issue with her actually eating the greens or the herbs in the garden beds. But all dogs are a little bit different when it comes to that. So Big Will Dog 82 says, my dogs just love eating anything green and taller than them. There you go. So barriers, when you've got the dogs eating in your garden and you don't want them to, it's a barrier. That's really the best way you've got to deal with it. And yeah, like Jay says, tuck is definitely a good example of that. And I'll do that. I'll intentionally give Mala a carrot when I'm harvesting, just like James gives Tuck the carrots and other things he's harvesting in the garden. So that can be fun and that can keep them occupied. Mala likes she hasn't done it because most of them are frozen and under snow right now, but she likes tomatoes and she will pluck cherry tomatoes off the plants as she walks by. So I'm okay with that because I grow so many cherry tomatoes. But she'll also bring the tomatoes in the house as like a ball to play with, the bigger tomatoes, the green ones that might fall off the plant. So it's fun to see them playing with the tomatoes and other fruits like that. It's just a question of whether you have the patience to accept it or not. And I'm okay with most of what she likes to do. Yeah, Sherry says would love to see Mala picking tomatoes. I actually have a short that show, or it might be on Instagram. No, I think it's a YouTube short that shows Mala using a green tomato as a little chew toy. She doesn't actually eat the green tomatoes. She's kind of gnaws on it and rolls it around a little bit. But I do have a video that shows Mala with a green tomato. And if I take a picture of her stealing some of the tomatoes, I'll do the same thing. I'll throw it up on Instagram and YouTube short for you to see when the weather warms up a little bit more. But Jenkins is saying our dog used to pick all the low-hanging strawberries and raspberries. Yeah, good point. I'd forgotten about that. Mala will get some of the raspberries. I've seen her do that. I haven't seen her grab any of the strawberries, but I have seen her eat some of the raspberries. So that's definitely an issue. And this year she was eating some of the gooseberries, but I think she was snagging the gooseberries, some of them before they were ripe, and they don't taste that good. But then she found a bush where they were all ripe. She cleaned that one up pretty good. So always lots of fun. Tammy says, I'm glad my garden dog isn't the only one that loves tomatoes. He doesn't pick his own, but he lets me know when he wants one and they are ripe. There you go. Yeah, they're not dumb. They know what tastes good, and all those fruits have lots of vitamins that can help them out. So why not take advantage of it? And it's a lot of fun. I think if you're going to have an animal in the garden, like those of us with garden dogs, you just have to accept that that's going to happen. And I grow lots of extra plants and have lots of extra harvest, and most of it's going to end up being eaten by me or used in preservation or fall to the ground and be eaten by a dog or a rabbit or a deer or whatever happens to be out there. So that's all part of gardening. Moon Dust says, how do you overwinter crops that need overwintering, like apple trees, for example? So I really don't do anything extra when it comes to overwintering. So the first step is choosing a variety that can be overwintered. And that's what the hardiness zones are all about. So I'm in zone 5B, and almost all of my fruit trees are suitable for zone 4. So that means however cold it gets, however snowy and windy it gets, those trees are going to survive. And so I'm really not doing anything other than just letting those trees grow. Now, I do surround them with the wire fencing to keep mala and the deer out, and I do cover them with bird netting so that the deer can't eat the tips of the branches. But that's all there is to it. The strawberries, the same way. The strawberry varieties I have can handle my cold winters. And I've mentioned this before in live streams as well. I don't add layers of mulch to my strawberries. I just let the leaves dry, and those dried leaves are enough to protect the plant. And then in spring, when things warm up, I'll clear off the dried strawberry leaves and open up that crown so that the plant can start growing. And so I'm really not doing anything extra. Most plants that will overwinter. The perennials that grow from one season to the next have those kind of natural insulation. So my ornamental grasses, for instance, I don't cut the grass down going into winter. I leave the ornamental grasses in place because all those dried grass stalks act as insulation for the interior of the plant. In the spring, then you clear off the leaves or the grass stalks or whatever it happens to be. So I just let nature overwinter the plant by itself. And if I were growing something that was not suitable for my zone, so if I were trying to grow zone 6 or zone 7 plants, then I would have to overwinter. I would have to add that insulation. I would have to add that protection. But because the plants that I'm allowing to grow can handle my cold, I let them handle it for themselves, and it works. It's one of those things like with my apple trees. I do nothing for my apple trees and they come back every year and get bigger because it's the right kind of tree for my environment. And why I can't grow lemon trees because it's just too cold for lemon trees and a lot of other types of trees that fall into that category. So choose the right plant for your climate, and it's really easy. Now, things like peppers that you want to overwinter, you have to dig them up and move them into a protected area. That's the same basic idea of growing a plant that isn't going to survive your winters. You got to take that extra effort, but I'm not doing a lot of that, so it ends up being really easy in my garden because I just let the cold come and then I just wait until spring when the buds pop up and the leaves emerge. And it's as easy as that. And I like easy when it comes to my garden and the things that I'm going to be growing. So let's see. Frank Barnwell says apple, pear, plum, nut trees, nothing. So I'm assuming that's part of the same comment where you don't have to do anything. And the Wickeshire Project Off Grid says most apple trees are fine in cold weather. They produce a type of antifreeze. This is normal dormant behavior. Yeah, absolutely. So those of us that are doing it the same way, uh, yeah, it's so easy. I do nothing. Well, I prune. I'll prune off the dead branches or damaged branches from the previous year, but that's all I do with my fruit trees is just clean them up a little bit in the winter and then just wait for the new growth. It really doesn't get much easier than that as long as you spend the time choosing what you do in the beginning. RP says, I'm pushing the limits trying to grow an avocado tree, but it's work. There you go. Yeah. So if you want to do the extra work, you can do it. Those of us that are a little bit lazier and don't want to do work when it's really cold outside, we take the easy approach. But sure, absolutely. You want to do the work, you can definitely make it happen. I'd love to be able to grow an avocado tree, but even with work, there's no way I can make it happen. My greenhouse, I've got some fig tree, Chicago fig, which is a hardy fig tree. Was concerned that they wouldn't be able to survive outside, probably rightly so. So I put them in my greenhouse. So that's that extra little bit of work I did to be able to grow fig trees. A hardy fig is actually put them in my greenhouse where it's the equivalent of 2 zones warmer. And they survived last year. So I actually planted them in 2022 and had them in my unheated greenhouse with no water all last winter. And they came back fine this last year. Now I have that extra protection in my greenhouse with the water. I anticipate they're going to do great this year because it's actually warmer in my greenhouse this winter than it was last winter. So, and it all comes down to the plant selection and what you are able to do as far as protecting the plants. Dusty Flat says, lost a grape with too hot of spring with a freak frost. Winery lost 95% of the grapes. Wow. Watch the weather as it advanced the growth too much last year. Yeah, that's a big issue, especially with grapes. Losing 95%. That's just crazy. I did see that on, I have seen that in the past with some of my trees, my fruit trees in particular, where we get a very warm spring and they bud early. And then here in Colorado, we always get a late frost. It's just a question of how cold that's going to be. My region here had that happen a few years ago. So the the house behind me here on the backside over behind Mala, they used to have, I think, 11 trees in their backyard. And you can kind of sort of see in this picture that there aren't any big trees in that yard. That was because of of a couple springs a number of years ago that happened, where everything was budding out, the leaves were growing, and then we had a freak spring freeze that killed all of the buds, killed all of the leaves, and the next year all the trees were dead because they didn't have any leaves to put energy into the roots. The roots were just using up the energy from the previous year, which was similar. And so the neighbor behind me cut all their trees down because they were all dead because of that weird pattern of the warm followed by the cold. So it didn't affect my apple trees as much because that's another thing when I choose my trees is I try to choose the ones that have late blooming so that the buds aren't set too early because I've just learned here in Colorado that we're going to have that late freeze. So learn those kind of patterns in your garden, and again, that'll change the way you garden because you'll learn that you have to choose a variety that can handle your specific environment to be able to have the success that you're hoping for. Sabi Gal's wondering, can you use walls of water in a greenhouse to help protect from cold at some times? Absolutely. And so that's one of those things that it's part of my experimentation. So one of my favorite channels for years is 1 Yard Revolution. Now he hasn't made videos in a number of years. I think it's been at least 3 years since he's made videos, but he has some videos where he shows his hoop houses and with the hoops inside the hoop houses, and that's the idea behind the wall of waters. And I've got a ton of wall of water, and and so next year, I'm actually planning to experiment by trying to add some heat sources and do things like the wall of water in the greenhouse to get some of the plants going a little bit earlier. So absolutely, wall of water. I got a video on using wall of waters. We'll see if Jay can find this one. It's an old video. It's got let's see, it's at least 5 years old. No, it's probably 6 or 7 years old. But I do have an older video on using the wall of waters and very effective. I've grown tomatoes in the snow using the wall of water. And so adding that is that extra protection in an unheated greenhouse. Absolutely. Absolutely. It can be a way to protect the plants from the cold. And it's all about the heat. And so especially here, you can see in the sky behind me, it's a relatively clear day today, crazy cold, but my greenhouse is still going to warm up and the water's going to warm up. So I posted on Instagram yesterday that the water was freezing in my greenhouse. Those jugs of water and those containers of water I had were freezing, a light layer of ice. And so they were right there at 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 0 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. Later in the day, I measured the temperatures because it was nice and sunny yesterday. And so at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday, the water had heated up to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius. And so just over the course of a few hours, because of the sun in that enclosed greenhouse, the water warmed up dramatically. And the same thing would happen with the wall of water. That's all it is just those water tubes. So that would also suck up all that sun energy and warm up and then help protect those plants over the course of the evening. And inside the greenhouse, it even makes it much better. So great idea. And yes, I think that is something that if you're experimenting and trying to figure out what you can do in your greenhouse and it's an unheated greenhouse, add the extra hoops of plastic inside the greenhouse, or the wall water inside the greenhouse, or even a plastic or glass cloche to cover the plant in the greenhouse, that can absolutely make a big difference. Hills Mill Homestead, hello to you. Thank you for all your outstanding information for gardens and homesteading. Well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm glad that you say that, because I do appreciate, and I am trying to do more and more with the homesteading and idea, because it's not just gardening. I think too many channels are focused on just how to grow a particular plant. I think it's more the concept of how we approach our gardens in general. And I really like the homesteading aspect of it. And so I am getting more and more involved with homesteading. And coincidentally, my son, who lives in Louisiana, is becoming more and more involved with homesteading. And so I'm advising him a little bit, and that's also enlightening me as he teaches me about some aspects of homesteading. He actually has his own YouTube channel now, Ready Set Homestead, and it's a new channel. He's doing pretty well. He's adding more and more videos on chickens and turkeys and a lot of what he's doing in his homestead. So thank you for saying that, Hills Mill, because I am planning on doing more videos with a homesteading focus, including hopefully making some videos with my son in Louisiana as he does more and more with his homesteading. It's so much fun. He has a couple videos. He actually has a short on YouTube that has millions of views. He's got a couple of them, but one in particular, and it's with a turkey, and he slaughtered a turkey, and he's got another one with a chicken that was diseased, and he had to cull his flock because of that. And so he's making videos on how to deal with the turkeys that you're raising for food, and how to deal with the chickens that you have to take out of your flock. And so he's really, being the proud papa. He's doing a great job helping others out with homesteading. And so I'm using him as a good example for myself as I try to move more and more in that direction as well. And that's why making the change this year towards medicinal gardening is something that's now on my radar that wasn't so much on my radar before, is because that also plays into some of that homesteading aspect where you are raising plants for your health in addition to your diet and just giving your family food to grow. So it's all part of the evolution as we continue down our gardening pathways and finding those things that work for us, and those new things that are actually going to change some of how we want to garden, which I think is really important. Thank you for that, Jay. Yeah, there's his Ready Set Homestead YouTube link, and he's having fun with it, and he's making some good videos. He learned the hard way. He built a chicken coop, and he hadn't completely designed it as well as he should have. And so the door closed, and he got stuck inside his chicken coop and couldn't get out. And so once he was rescued, he designed it so that there was a release on the inside, a cord that you could pull to open the chicken coop door to get out. Well, he made a short video last week where his wife got stuck inside the coop, but the cord was outside the coop, so she wasn't able to rescue herself. So I haven't talked to him about it, but I'm guessing he's going to have to figure out a better design so that no one gets stuck in the coop again. But those are some of the fun things about homesteading, and some of the things you learn along the way that you never anticipate. You can design the best coop imaginable, and then end up getting stuck inside because you never thought that was going to happen. So lots of fun stuff. Hey, Tony, I just saw Simplified Gardening has joined us just as we're getting to the end of it. And Wicked Sure Project is giving a fist bump. So fist bump to Tony as well. And a teaser, Tony O'Neill's going to be on our live stream in the near future. And so look for that in the weeks ahead. Tony will be a guest and we'll be talking vegetable gardening, of course, when we get together. Always fun to talk with Tony. And then, of course, we'll be answering all the questions that you throw out at us. Tennessee Nana says Homesteader's Herbal Companion by Amy Fuel is a good book, especially for beginners. I will check that out. Thank you for that suggestion. I appreciate it. And Tony's on the way home from work. So hope it was another safe day at work, Tony. Always nice to have you here. And it's always nice to have all of you here. It's so great. If you've been joining us late, you can always, of course, watch again from the beginning and not miss out on anything in this live stream. Over the course of the next month, I've got 3 different guests lined up that will be chatting different gardening topics. So you have that to look forward in the weeks ahead. And then, of course, I'm always here on Mondays to answer your questions and talk gardening, especially on the frigid day like we have today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. And hopefully it will be a much warmer week next Monday as we get closer to springtime and get out there and actually do some work in our gardens, which is always preferred to sitting inside and just looking at catalogs. See you then. Hope it's a wonderful week. Stay warm, and I'll see you again next Monday. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.